Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 134th deck and it's titled Back Alley Mogging. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So before we, of course, get into the deck, we gotta talk about the random card. This one is suggested by Salty and Sunshine over on Discord and Patreon. You may also know Salty and Sunshine as Luke, who will actually be showing up later in this video as a part of the game as well. So it's kind of cool that he got to play in the same game for the card that he suggested. But the card that was suggested was Mogg Bombers. And Mogg Bombers is 3 and a red for a 3/4 goblin. If any other creature comes into play, sacrifice Mogg Bombers and it deals 3 damage to target player. Now, this is a very weird card, and there's a lot that could be done with it, but it also doesn't look like it does too much on the surface. So let me explain some of the ways that this deck is going to function. Let's talk about our commander, some themes, and some key cards, and then we'll talk about the combo, because this is a combo deck centered around Mogg Bombers. But I think before we get to the combo, we do have to talk about how the deck functions, otherwise there's no point in talking about the combo. So of course, let's get into our commander, or in this case, commanders, because we are playing a partner pairing this week. We're playing Alena Kessig Trapper and Kydele Chosen of Kruphix. So Alena is 4 and a red for a 4/3 human scout, first strike. Tap, add an amount of red equal to the greatest power among creatures you control that entered the battlefield this turn. And of course, she has partner. And her partner for this deck is Kydele Chosen of Kruphix, which is 2 green-blue for a 2/3 legendary creature human wizard. Tap, add a colorless to your mana pool for each card you've drawn this turn. And once again, of course, partner. Now, looking at these two, you might notice they don't really have anything to do with Mogg Bombers, but they are both mana dorks. So you can kind of get the sense that we actually want to have a ton of mana at any given point, because really our combo that's going to involve Mogg Bombers is going to require us to have a lot of mana, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But the most important thing that we need to understand right now is we are Temur colors, so blue, green, and red, and we're technically comboing off with Mogg Bombers. So let's take a look at some of our themes, and I will explain some of the misdirection in the deck and also some of the things we're trying to really focus on. So first, of course, let's talk about that misdirection. We want the table to think that we are a Temur Goblin deck. So we are playing a bunch of goblins, but most of the goblins we're playing either create tokens or give buffs to the rest of the goblins. We're not specifically going out of our way to play goblins that give us some random effect or just kind of exist. We want them to pump up the rest of the team or add to our board. And a great example of that is Goblin Chieftain, which is 1 red for a 2/2 goblin. He's got haste, and other goblin creatures you control get +1/+1 and also have haste. So if we're making a ton of goblin tokens, this is a great way to make sure that we can swing out. And what we really want our opponents to think is that we are going to be an incredibly aggressive deck that's aiming to knock them out with combat damage, when in reality, that's not the case. Mogg Bombers doesn't care about combat damage. The next theme that we're going to have to focus on is going to be the ramp aspect of this. Like I mentioned earlier, we really need a lot of mana to make our combo work. So we want to find ways to ramp as many lands into play as possible, and Roiling Regrowth is a great way to do that because it's 2 and a green for an instant, sacrifice a land, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Since we can do this at instant speed, we can hold up interaction if we need to. We can make our opponents think that we have a counter spell even when we don't, or we have a removal spell even when we don't. So it's a great way to ramp, but also still kind of keep the rest of the table at bay. And if I'm being perfectly honest, Roiling Regrowth, I suppose, if I could actually speak, has really gone up in my opinion lately, and I think it's very worth putting into the deck. And then finally, our last theme is going to be doubling damage. And this one, again, is going to make a little bit more sense later, but even with just our goblins, doubling the damage can really add up, because it's going to turn our 1/1s into 2/2s. And if they have a pump from Goblin Chieftain, for example, then they're 2/2s, hitting like they're 4/4s. So a good example of this is Dictate of the Twin Gods, which is 3 red for an enchantment. has flash. If a source would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage instead. Now, it is very important to mention that this is double-sided, no pun intended, but the intention of this is to double the damage that we are doing to our opponents. There are some effects, like Dictate of the Twin Gods, that double it to everybody, so be aware of that if this is a card you're playing, which is why you most likely want to play it at flash speed, either at the end of someone's turn or in combat to kind of trick people into thinking that they might survive a combat step. Now, with all of our themes out of the way, we still haven't actually talked about a combo. So let's look at some key cards, and I know I keep saying this, I'm going to save the combo until we get to the last card, but the other two are going to build up to it, I promise. So stick around for that one. But the first key card is Assault Suit. And this looks really strange when you look at the build of our deck. We're ramping, we're playing goblins, we're going wide. We don't really care about giving away our creatures or making sure that we have one big creature that we can pass around the table. But Assault Suit has some very key words on it. So let's read through it and I'll explain why it's here. First up, it is a 4-mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has haste, can't attack you or a planeswalker you control, and can't be sacrificed. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you may have that player gain control of equipped creature until the end of turn. If you do, untap it. It also equips for 3. Now, the most important line of text on this entire card is the phrase, "It can't be sacrificed." Mogg Bombers is incredibly unique because the sacrifice isn't part of what's triggering the ability, the sacrifice is part of the resolution. So technically, if we have Mogg Bombers equipped with Assault Suit and another creature comes into play, we put a trigger on the stack that says do 3 damage to any target opponent, and then we sacrifice Mogg Bombers. We cannot sacrifice Mogg Bombers, but we do still get to do the 3 damage. That means that we can just point that 3 damage at an opponent, and now every single time a creature comes into play, whether it's ours or our opponent's, we get to do 3 damage divided up however we'd like, depending on how many creatures entered the battlefield. That is also why we're playing so heavily into the token strategy, because if we can make, say, 5 goblin tokens out of nowhere, that's 15 damage that we just get to shoot around the table, which can be very game-changing. And of course, since we're talking about tokens already, that's going to lead us into our second key card, which is Second Harvest. 2 green for an instant. For each token you control, put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that permanent. So if we just made 5 goblin tokens and we did 15 damage, now we can double them, make 5 more, do 15 more damage, and that's enough to almost knock someone out from their starting life total. But as weird as it is, we have other cards that do the same thing. Why would Second Harvest be one of our key cards? Why is this the most important token doubler or token generator that we have? And that is because it's at instant speed. Mogg Bombers will actually sacrifice itself when another creature comes into play. So if we don't have Assault Suit, and we go to sacrifice Mogg Bombers, we could cast Second Harvest in response to make more tokens, all of which will trigger Mogg Bombers all at the exact same time. And the most important tokens that we could possibly copy with Second Harvest are going to be our combo tokens. And that is where we finally get to talk about the combo of this deck. That is Mogg Bombers plus Rite of Replication. So Rite of Replication is 2 blue for a sorcery, has kicker for 5. Put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of target creature. If Rite of Replication was kicked, put 5 of those tokens onto the battlefield instead. This is what we want to do. And the reason we need so much mana is because we have to make sure that nobody else casts a creature after we put Mogg Bombers into play. So if we cast Mogg Bombers and pass, there's a very good chance that we will not get to untap with the Bombers. So we need 4 mana to cast Mogg Bombers and then 9 mana to kick a Rite of Replication. Because what that's going to do is make 5 token copies of the Mogg Bombers. Now, the original Mogg Bombers have just seen 5 other Mogg Bombers come into play. That's 15 damage right there. each of the other Mogg Bombers have seen 4 Mogg Bombers come into play because they see themselves enter the battlefield. That right there is 12 damage times 4 plus another 15. I'm not going to do that math off the top of my head. I had it written down somewhere, but it's a ton of damage. Now, the real combo is if we have Rite of Replication with Mogg Bombers plus a token doubler, like Second Harvest, that could be cast at instant speed. So all of the abilities go on the stack. We are now preparing to sacrifice all of our Mogg Bombers, but before those abilities resolve, we can Second Harvest, make 5 more Rite of Replication token copies of Mogg Bombers. Now all the other Mogg Bombers have seen 5 more enter the battlefield, and those 5 have seen themselves enter the battlefield as well. At that point, we should have more than enough damage to divide around the table to knock out everyone else who's playing. If for some reason that's still not enough damage, we also can fall back on our damage doublers like Dictate of the Twin Gods. Now each of those Moggs is doing 6 damage per trigger instead of 3, meaning that we are doubling all of the damage plus all of the tokens. And honestly, at that point, if we're not able to knock out the table with all that damage, then we were probably losing that game anyway. But that is our main combo and what we want to be doing with Mogg Bombers. So hopefully that made some sense. Like I have said in the past, I'm not great with math, but this is one of those situations where it's kind of like I probably don't need to really do the damage because it's gonna happen, and whether we count it up or not, it's probably gonna be enough. So anyway, that is enough talking about our combo and our key cards. The next thing we should do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. These are the cards that synergize very well together, and even if they don't necessarily win us the game outright, they are at least interesting enough to talk about and push us toward a victory. So the first cool interaction I want to talk about is between Goblin Chirurgeon and Runedvelt Hordemaster. One of the things that we do with this deck is we actually put a lot of our card draw effects onto our goblins, and we don't have a great number of ways to trigger those other than combat or with our creatures dying. So if those are the ways that we want to be drawing cards, we can use Goblin Chirurgeon to force us to draw cards, kind of drawing cards, it's technically exile, but either way it's card advantage. So Goblin Chirurgeon is 1 red for a 0/2 goblin. You can pay 0 and sacrifice a goblin to regenerate target creature. This is a great way to protect our combo pieces, protect the Mogg Bomber if we need to. It won't protect it from sacrificing it, but maybe from removal. And then we're going to partner that up with Runedvelt Hordemaster, which is 1 and a red for a 1/1 goblin warrior. Other goblins you control get +1/+1, and whenever it or another goblin you control dies, exile the top card of your library. If it's a goblin creature card, you may cast that card until the end of your next turn. Now there is a chance that we exile something else that we would like, so we could exile Rite of Replication, so do be very careful with this. But there's also a chance we exile some other creatures to bring into play. We exile the Mogg Bombers so that we can cast it. This is a great way to force us into card draw, because the Chirurgeon can just sacrifice all of our goblin tokens, then we exile cards from the top of our deck, we can cast the goblins. It's a great way to regen all of our board, so if someone goes to board wipe, we sacrifice half of it, keep half of it, exile some cards. This is going to be something that's really going to push our opponents to think that we are a full goblin deck and kind of get them to ignore the combo, hopefully making them think that if they keep our board clear, then we won't be a threat, which is not the case because we want a combo in 1 turn, but it's also a good way to make sure we always have things to do. Now that is going to be very different from our next cool interaction, which is going to be between Ovika Enigma Goliath and City on Fire. So Ovika Enigma Goliath is a great way to generate tokens because it is 5 blue red for a 6/6 Phyrexian Nightmare, flying, ward 3, and pay 3 life. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create X 1/1 red Phyrexian goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. They gain haste until the end of turn. We're going to partner that up with City on Fire, which is 5 red, for an enchantment with Convoke. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage instead. This now turns our Mogg Bombers into doing 3 damage, now they're doing 9. And even our little 1/1 goblin tokens are doing 3 damage each, and that is a huge upcrease, I don't think that's a word, increase in the damage that they're doing, and upshift is the word I was looking for. And that's going to allow us to really close out the game very, very quickly. Plus, City on Fire is a non-creature spell which will trigger Ovika and will make a massive 8 goblin tokens. And then those goblin tokens that we may have made with some other Ovika triggers can actually convoke to cast City on Fire because they are red creatures. We could just tap 8 of them, make City on Fire come in for free, and then we get 8 more goblin tokens that just swing as 3/3s because they have haste. So this is an incredibly powerful combination of cards that can really close out a game very, very quickly, and it can make sure that no matter what our opponents are doing, we're going to have some way to interact with it, because they're just going to have to stop these goblins. And if you're stopping a whole horde of 3/3 goblins, you're probably not going to be either having a bunch of blockers or having a really high life total. And if our opponents don't have blockers, don't have life totals, Mogg Bomber comes in and just cleans up the mess. So that is it for our cool interactions this week. So let's move on to the actual price of our deck. And this week our price came in at $88.23. And honestly, a huge portion of that is from a single card, because that is Adrix and Nev Twin Casters. And Adrix and Nev is 2 green blue for a 2/2 legendary creature merfolk wizard. They have Ward 2, and if one or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many of those tokens are created instead. Now, Adrix and Nev is a massive $15, which means if you're actually looking to trim down the price of the deck, simply cutting Adrix and Nev drops it down to about $73, which is a much better improvement from $88. But the reason that I wanted to kind of splurge and make sure that we had Adrix and Nev is that it is the cheapest token doubler that I could actually find, specifically because this was made before Enchanting Tales came out, and there are some that dropped in price because of that. But Adrix and Nev was the cheapest at the time, and it's still pretty expensive even though it was the cheapest at $15. But the reason that I wanted to try so hard to have Adrix and Nev as a token doubler is that because when we go to Rite of Replication, one of our Mogg Bombers, instead of making 5 Mogg Bombers, we make 10. And each of those Moggs will see all the others come into play, meaning that we're doing 30 damage with the original and 27 damage with each of the other 10 that come in. And if that's not enough to close out the game, then really I have no idea what is. So Adrix and Nev, phenomenal in this deck, very difficult to get rid of because Ward 2 is surprisingly more difficult to pay than you would think. So I do recommend keeping it in the deck if you are capable of doing so, but like I said earlier, if you do need to cut it to trim down the price, that is something you can do as well. Now, with that being said, I do have a suggestion for an out-of-budget upgrade and what I would replace it with as well. So obviously, we're going to talk more about some cards that I would love to put in the slot with Adrix and Nev. So the out-of-budget upgrade for this week is Parallel Lives, and this is one of those cards that did see a price decrease from the Enchanting Tales, but it is still very expensive. So Parallel Lives is 3 and a green for an enchantment. If an effect would put 1 or more tokens onto the battlefield under your control, it puts twice that many of those tokens onto the battlefield instead. It's still a massive $25.80, even though it had a recent reprint, so definitely not something we can squeeze into our deck, but definitely worth thinking about if you're putting this deck together yourself. And if you do put it into the deck, the card that I would recommend taking out is Gretchen Titchwillow. And Gretchen is a green and a blue for a 0/4 legendary creature halfling druid. You can pay 2 green and a blue, draw a card, and you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, I kind of wanted to test Gretchen because I've thought about putting her in some decks but have never done so. And I wanted to see how she worked in this deck because we really care about the ramp, and I figure if we have nothing better to do, we can always activate her ability, draw a card. Maybe we don't even have a land to put in, but at least it's consistent card draw. And I'm not gonna lie, she really felt underwhelming the couple of times that I played this deck. If I had her, I might play her as a 0/4, but I almost never activated her ability. It didn't feel relevant enough, and there was always something else that we wanted to be doing. There's a surprising amount of card draw in this deck, so I don't think her ability is necessary. And since it's not necessary, you might as well just replace it with Parallel Lives if budget is of no concern. But if budget is a concern, then obviously a $25 card can't exactly come in for a 7-cent card, so that is something to be considering. But that is the only out of budget upgrade that I have for you this week. So of course we gotta see how this deck performs in a game and see how it runs against some other opponents. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about some ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So if you want to find us on some other platforms, you can find us on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13. You can find us over at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com if you want to send us some emails. And if you're looking to support the channel, other than, of course, just liking the video and subscribing to the channel, because I know a lot of people watch this and are not subscribed, I would love it if you could help us hit 1,000 by the end of the year. That is my goal. You can help us make it there, and I would very much appreciate it. But if you are looking to support us even more directly than just that, you can find us over on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get access to the deck lists a week early, unedited gameplay videos, a Discord channel where we brew up the videos and also play in the videos. So if you want to be in them, that is a great way to do it. And I'll send you a random card every single month as a thank you. It is one of the cards that we build around, so could get something very, very sweet. So if you want to join the 10 amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Patty Whack, you can find us on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member. So with all of that being said, let's actually take a look at how this deck performs in a game and look at some of our opponents for this week. So starting off with our opponents, we have 3 of them for this week. We're going to be playing against Doodle and his Gallia of the Endless Dance deck, playing against Bilal, Calamax the Stormsire, and playing against Luke, Salty and Sunshine, who requested this deck, playing Marchesa the Black Rose. And before we really get into this, I want to take a second to just say how appreciative I am of this actual game, because this is the first time that I got to play against some decks that I actually built. So the Gallia of the Endless Dance deck that Doodle is playing is the Gruul Reanimator deck that I actually built for this channel just a little while ago, and the Marchesa the Black Rose deck is also a deck that I built for this channel way back almost a couple years ago now, that I built for Luke because he had suggested the card for the week and he liked it so much that he put it together himself. Now the Gallia deck has been upgraded a little bit, so it is not 100% our Gruul Reanimator deck. I think the main upgrade that Doodle made was Lifeline, which was out of our budget, but it was one that he was able to make, which is awesome, and I look forward to seeing the upgrades. The Marchesa deck, though, that Luke is playing is 100% the original deck that I made for this channel. So I will make sure that both of those decks lists are located somewhere either in the video itself or in the description. If you are interested, please do check out the deck techs and the games with those, because I was very proud of both of those decks and I'm genuinely looking forward to playing against them. I don't think they know in the moment how much that meant to me, but I really do appreciate it. Getting to see my own decks is very, very special to me. So thank you so much, you guys. I think that's probably enough on those decks, but we do have to talk about Bilal's deck as well, which is Calamax the Stormsire. Now this one I did not build, but Bilal is very well known for being a combo-centric player, so I do expect some combos to come out of Calamax. I probably expect this to be a lot of Storm. I'm not 100% sure how he's going to Storm, considering Calamax only copies the first instant spell that's cast every turn, but I'm sure he'll find a way. So I am very excited for that, and it's probably the deck that I'm the most concerned about, because it's the only deck that I don't know what's in it. So I'm looking forward to this game. I hope you all are as well. So let's jump into it, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Doodle, Bilal, and then Luke. On my first turn, I play a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1. Doodle plays a Path of Ancestry. Bilal plays a Fabled Passage, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Luke plays a Dismal Backwater, gaining a life. I play a Path of Ancestry. Doodle plays a Mountain, then casts his commander Gallia of the Endless Dance, then attacks me for 2 since she has haste. Bilal plays a Breeding Pool untapped, paying 2 life. Luke plays an island and casts Viscera Seer, letting him sacrifice a creature to scry 1. I play a mountain and cast Goblin Matron, searching my deck for a goblin, in this case Mogg Bombers, putting it into my hand. Doodle plays a forest, then casts Phoenix of Ash and attacks Luke for 2 with Gallia. At the end of turn, Bilal casts a Thrill of Possibility, discarding a card to draw 2. On Bilal's turn, he plays an island, then casts Baral, Chief of Compliance, making his instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, and also allowing him to draw a card and discard a card whenever he counters a spell. Luke plays a swamp, then casts Bastion of Remembrance, making a 1/1 human soldier token, and also making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature dies under his control. I play a forest and cast my commander Kydele, Chosen of Kruphix, which can tap for colorless mana equal to the number of cards I've drawn that turn. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Bitter Reunion, discarding a card to draw 2 cards and also being able to sacrifice it to give all his creatures haste until the end of turn. He moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 2 with his Phoenix, then at the end of turn, Bilal casts Stun, preventing Baral from blocking this turn and drawing a card. On Bilal's turn, he casts Roiling Regrowth, sacrificing an island to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Luke plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a mountain, putting it into play tapped. I play a forest and cast my other commander, Alena Kydele Trapper, which can tap for red mana equal to the highest power among creatures I control that entered the battlefield this turn. At the end of turn, Doodle casts his own Thrill of Possibilities, discarding a card to draw 2. On Doodle's turn, he plays a forest and casts Sunstreak Phoenix, making it day. He then sacrifices Bitter Reunion, giving his creatures haste, allowing him to attack me for 6 with his Phoenixes and Bilal for 2 with Gallia, triggering his commander on attack to discard a card at random and draw 2. Bilal then blocks with Baral and I take 6. At the end of turn, Bilal casts Crimson Wisps, making Baral a red creature until the end of turn and drawing a card. Then on his turn, he plays an island and casts his commander Calamax the Stormsire, letting him copy any instant he casts and put a +1/+1 counter on it as long as Calamax is tapped. In response though, Luke casts Counterspell, countering Bilal's commander. On Luke's turn, he plays an island and casts his own commander, Marchesa the Black Rose, putting a +1/+1 counter on any of his creatures that attack the player with the highest life total, and returning any of his creatures with a +1/+1 counter on them to the battlefield under his control when they die. He then attacks Doodle with a Soldier and Viscera Seer for 2, but before damage, Bilal casts Inscription of Abundance, having Baral fight the Viscera Seer, and in response, Luke sacrifices it to itself, scrying 1, gaining a life and making each opponent lose a life. Then the Marchesa trigger resolves, putting a counter on the soldier, and Doodle takes 2. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast Moria Marauder, letting me exile the top card of my library and play it until the end of turn whenever I deal combat damage to a player with a goblin. I attack Doodle for 1 with Goblin Matron, exiling Growth Spiral. I then cast the Growth Spiral, drawing a card and putting a command tower from my hand into play. After that, I cast a Beetleback Chief, making 2 1/1 goblin tokens when it enters the battlefield. Doodle moves straight to combat on his turn, attacking Luke for 2 with Gallia, me for 4 with a Phoenix, and Bilal for 2 with a Phoenix. On attacks, Gallia triggers, so Doodle discards a card at random and draws 2. Before that though, he casts Reincarnate, targeting Gallia, so that when she dies this turn he's able to return another creature from his graveyard to the battlefield. Once that's resolved, Bilal casts Invigorate for free since he controls a forest, letting Luke gain 3 life and giving Gallia +4/+4. This means that I take 4 damage, Bilal takes 2, and Luke takes 6 rather than blocking with his commander, unfortunately wasting Doodle's Reincarnate and finally resolving his Gallia trigger. Second main phase, Doodle plays a mountain and casts Nim Deathmantle. On Bilal's turn, he plays a forest and recasts his commander Calamax. Luke plays a swamp and attacks Doodle with Marchesa, triggering her own Dethrone ability, putting a +1/+1 counter on herself and hitting Doodle for 4. In my upkeep, it becomes night since Luke cast no spells on his turn, and I move to combat attacking Doodle for 5 and Luke for 2 with all my goblins. Luke blocks the Beetleback Chief with his soldier, killing both creatures, gaining Luke a life and making each of his opponents lose a life, while Doodle takes 5 and I trigger Moria Marauders 5 times, exiling 2 mountains, Goblin King, Eureka Moment, and Goblin Chirurgeon. In my second main phase, I play a mountain from exile, then cast Eureka Moment from exile, drawing 2 cards and putting a forest into play from my hand. After that, I cast Angrath's Marauders, doubling all damage that would be done by sources I control. After that, I cast a Goblin King, giving all other goblins +1/+1 in Mountain Walk. Then finally, I cast Goblin Chirurgeon, letting me sacrifice a goblin to regenerate target creature. In Doodle's upkeep, it becomes day again since I cast 2 or more spells on my turn, then he casts Verdant Confluence, returning Artisan of Kozilek from his graveyard to his hand and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. He then plays a Temple of Abandon, scrying 1, and passes. Bilal casts Gutter Snipe, making each opponent take 2 damage whenever he casts an instant or sorcery. He moves to combat and attacks me for 4 with Calamax, and I block with Angrath's Marauders. Before damage, Bilal casts Tyvar's Last Stand, giving Calamax indestructible, hexproof, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, and doing 2 damage to each opponent. Still before damage, I sacrifice a goblin to regenerate the Marauders. Then both creatures survive combat and I take no damage. Luke plays a mountain and casts Blatant Thievery, gaining control of 1 permanent for each opponent. This lets him take the Angrath's Marauders, Nim Deathmantle, and Calamax. In response, Bilal casts Poison the Blade to give Calamax Death Touch and a +1/+1 counter, also drawing 2 cards since the spell is copied, and doing 2 damage to each opponent. Luke then attacks me for 8 with Marchesa, and I block with Goblin Chirurgeon, sacrificing another Goblin token to regenerate it, taking no damage. On my turn, I attack Luke for 4, Bilal for 4, and Doodle for 1 with all of my goblins, which are unblockable thanks to Mountain Walk. This triggers the Marauders 5 times, exiling an island, Gretchen Titchwillow, Assault Suit, Blasphemous Act, and Adrix and Neb Twincasters. In my second main phase, I cast the Assault Suit from exile, then play an island from exile, and cast Mogg Bombers, sacrificing it and doing 3 damage to an opponent whenever another creature enters the battlefield, immediately equipping it with Assault Suit so it gets +2/+2, can't be sacrificed, and can be given to an opponent for their turn in their upkeep. After that, I cast Adrix and Neb Twincasters from exile, doubling the number of tokens I create or counters I put on my creatures. This also triggers Mogg Bombers, doing 3 damage to Bilal, but thanks to the Assault Suit, it can't be sacrificed. On Doodle's turn, he cast Artisan of Kozilek, returning a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield, in this case Flayer of the Hatebound, which does damage equal to its power to any target whenever a creature enters the battlefield from the graveyard, this time doing 4 damage to Angrath's Marauders, killing it, gaining Luke a life, making each of his opponents lose a life. This also triggers Mogg Bombers twice, so I do 3 damage to both Luke and Bilal. Doodle then attacks Luke for 4 and me for 2. Bilal casts Zada Hedron Grinder, letting him copy any spell that targets only Zada for each other creature he controls, then each copy must target a different one of those creatures. Then I do 3 damage to Bilal. After that, he casts Charge Through, targeting Zada, copying it twice to give his creatures trample and draw 3 cards, doing 2 damage to each of his opponents. Luke plays an island and casts Agent of Treachery, gaining control of Mogg Bombers. Before that resolves, I do get to do 3 damage to Luke. He then attacks me for 6 with Calamax, and at the end of turn, Luke draws 3 cards with Agent of Treachery since he controls 3 permanents he doesn't own. On my turn, I attack Bilal for 2 and Luke for 7 with my goblins, triggering Moria Marauders and exiling an island, 2 forests, Rite of Replication, and Goblin Chieftain. I play an island from exile, re-equip the Assault Suit to Adrix and Nev, then cast Goblin Chieftain, giving my goblins +1/+1 in haste, also sacrificing the Mogg Bombers and letting Luke do 3 damage to me, gaining Luke a life and making each of his opponents lose a life. With the Mogg gone, I can safely cast Rite of Replication Kicked to make 5 copies of the Agent of Treachery, doubling my tokens with Adrix and Neb, so I make 10 total copies. Each one comes in and I gain control of every creature on my opponent's boards except for Gallia. In response to the targets, Bilal casts Tamio's Safekeeping on Zada, copying it for each of his creatures to give them all hexproof, letting him keep his board, gain 6 life, and do 2 damage to each opponent. Then in my end step, since I control 3 permanents that I don't own, I draw 3 cards for each Agent of Treachery, drawing a total of 33 cards. On Doodle's turn, he casts God Pharaoh's Gift, letting him exile a creature from his graveyard when he moves to combat, and create a token copy of it, except it's a 4/4. He also casts Aether Rift, discarding a card at random in his upkeep, then returning it to play if it's a creature, but an opponent can pay 5 life to prevent the effect. Then he moves to combat, exiling a Tali Primal Storm from his graveyard, making a 4/4 token copy of it. This lets him attack Bilal for 4 with a Tali, triggering itself when it attacks, so each player exiles the top card of their library, and Doodle gets to cast any number of them without paying their mana cost. This lets him cast Anger, Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, and Archmage Emeritus. On Bilal's turn, he casts Psychotic Fury, giving Gali a double strike until the end of turn, drawing a card, and doing 2 damage to each opponent. He then casts Archaeomancer, returning Crimson Wisps from his graveyard to his hand when it enters the battlefield. He plays a Lavatide Pathway and casts the Crimson Wisps, targeting Zada, copying it for each other creature he controls. This turns all his creatures red, gives them haste, draws him 4 cards, then does 2 damage to each opponent. He attacks me with his entire board for 8, but before blocks, I sacrifice my Goblin King to regenerate Kydele and, more importantly, take away Mountain Walk from Bilal's 2 goblins. Then I block all 4 attackers with Agents of Treachery, killing all of them as Bilal casts a Become Immense, targeting Zada, copying it for his entire team, giving them all +6/+6 until the end of turn, and doing 2 more damage to each opponent. On Luke's turn, he simply plays a Bloodfell Caves, gaining a life, and passes. In my upkeep, it becomes night since Luke cast no spells on his turn, then I cast a Siege Gang Commander, making 6 Goblin tokens when it enters. In response to the trigger though, Luke cast Chaos Warp, shuffling the Siege Gang Commander into my deck, letting me reveal the top card of my library, putting it into play if it's a permanent, which it's not, it's Invert Invent, so it stays on top of my library. Then I'm able to swing out with my entire board, sending enough damage to knock out the rest of the table, but unfortunately Luke has an answer, using Aetherize to return all my attacking creatures to their owner's hands. I do still get the Annihilator trigger from the Artisan of Kozilek, forcing Bilal to sacrifice 2 permanents. Then in my second main phase, I cast Insult, doubling the damage that would be dealt this turn, then immediately casting the Aftermath side, Injury, doing 4 damage to Bilal's Guttersnipe, killing it. Finally, I recast Goblin Cherugian and Moria Marauders. In Doodle's upkeep, it becomes day since I cast 2 or more spells on my turn. Then he also discards Artisan of Kozilek to Aether Rift, returning it to play since nobody's willing to pay 5 life to stop it. He also casts Greater Good, letting him sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to its power and then discard 3. This lets him sacrifice Anger, drawing 2 cards and discarding 3, but more importantly, giving all his creatures haste since it's now in his graveyard and he controls a mountain. After that, he recasts Sunstreak Phoenix, and when Doodle moves to combat, he exiles Defiler of Vigor from his graveyard, making a 4/4 token copy of it. Then he attacks me for 4, Bilal for 18, and Luke for 6, making Bilal sacrifice 2 permanents, then also exiling the top card of each player's library for a Tali, letting Doodle cast Invert Invent, searching his library for an instant and sorcery, getting Cathartic Pyre and search for survivors. Then he also casts the Okroan War, gaining control of Goblin Cherugian until the saga goes away, but he immediately sacrifices it to regenerate a Tali, and finally casts Lifeline, returning any creature that dies to the battlefield under its owner's control as long as there's at least 1 other creature still on the battlefield. Once all that has happened, but before damage, I cast Fog, preventing all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, saving the table. In Doodle's second main phase, he casts Sunstrike Phoenix to draw 4 cards and discard 3. He then sacrifices Gallia to draw 2 and discard 3, and finally sacrifices Artisan of Kozilek to draw 10 and discard 3. At the end of turn, Lifeline triggers, returning all creatures that died to their owners' battlefields. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Cinder Glade, then casts Jori and Ruin Diver, letting him draw a card when he casts his second spell each turn, and recasts his commander Calamax, drawing a card. On Luke's turn, he plays an island and casts Captivating Crew, which can be activated for 4 mana to let him gain control of target creature until the end of turn. He also recasts his commander Marchesa, then passes. On my turn, I cast Krenko Mob Boss, which can tap to create a number of goblin tokens equal to the number of goblins I control. Then I recast Goblin Chieftain, giving my goblins +1/+1 in haste. In response though, Doodle casts Cathartic Pyre, doing 3 damage to Krenko. To save him, I sacrifice Moria Marauder to regenerate him, but it does end with him being tapped. After that, I recast Goblin Matron, searching my library for a goblin, in this case Siege Gang Commander, putting it into my hand. Before I moved my end step though, Doodle sacrifices Artisan of Kozilek to draw 10 cards and discard 3, then he returns it to play when I move to my end step. In Doodle's upkeep, he discards Shigeki Jukai Visionary to Aether Rift, and since none of his opponents pay 5 life, he returns it to play. He then recasts Flayer of the Hatebound and immediately sacrifices it to draw 4 cards and discard 3. Then the Flayer's Undying ability triggers, returning it to play with a +1/+1 counter, doing 5 damage to me, knocking me out of the game. After that, he casts Cavalier of Flame, discarding 10 cards to draw 10 cards, and when he moves to combat, he exiles Skyfire Phoenix from his graveyard, making a 4/4 token copy of it. He doesn't have to attack though, as he's able to sacrifice Cavalier of Flame, doing 13 damage to each opponent since he has 13 lands in his graveyard. Finally, he moves to his end step, returning it to play with Lifeline, sacrificing it again to do another 13 damage, knocking both Luke and Bilal out and winning Doodle the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely one of my favorite games that I've played in a long time because there were a lot of moments in there that really shifted who could have won at any given time. So let's kind of go around the table and we'll talk about everybody's decks, and we'll end with ours just because, you know, it's the video that's talking about this deck, so we should probably end with it. But starting off with Doodle and his Gruul Reanimator list, or I guess our Gruul Reanimator list, comrade. In this case, it performed very, very well. Definitely did a better job showcasing it than I did in the video where I played it. And I think Lifeline was definitely a very sweet inclusion to the deck, and I think a very nice upgrade. And I'm very happy to see that he was able to win. Just the amount of value that he got from a lot of his reanimation targets, and the fact that he was able to get Aether Rift to trigger twice was very sweet. I've never actually seen Aether Rift go off, and I think from what Doodle had said, he hadn't either. So very, very cool to see, and very impressive showing. Moving down to Bilal, he kind of got a little bit stuck on mana. He didn't draw as many lands as he was hoping to. Even though he was missing a lot of land drops, he still put in quite a bit of work, and it was very impressive how many cards he drew. I wasn't exactly expecting the cantrip style effects, the instant speed draw a card, but with Calamax, it makes sense. He's able to draw one of those cantrips, cast it, and then draw 2 cards off of it, technically going up a card, which is super cool, and it's probably not tech that I would have thought of. And I'm sure we'll see Calamax again in the future, but still very scared of it because I know Calamax coming down can really change the course of the game. Moving on to Luke's Marchesa deck. Also very impressive, just being able to kind of steal things and then be able to possibly use them to, you know, come back into play under his control and just keep them around. Very, very cool. The Agent of Treachery actually played a huge role in the game, as did the Bribery in a way by taking Calamax. But the Agent of Treachery coming down and stealing the Mogg Bombers actually prevented me from winning the game at the end of it, and he debated for quite a while over which card he was going to take with the Agent of Treachery. And so choosing Mogg Bombers actually very much changed the end of the game, because on my next turn when I hit the Rite of Replication, I could still cast it and make 5, or I guess 10, because we had Adrix and Nev, 10 copies of the Mogg Bombers, which would have allowed me to put lethal damage on each of my opponents. But because Luke had the original Mogg Bombers, he would also get 5 instances of the Mogg Bombers trigger, which could then go on the stack after my triggers, and if he pointed them all at me, he could knock me out of the game before I could do anything with our Mogg Bombers triggers. That also meant that I couldn't just use it to copy his Agent of Treachery immediately, because the same thing's going to happen. 10 creatures are going to come in, the Mogg's going to see them, and he's going to point those 10 triggers at me, knock me out, and then send them everywhere else. So he really changed the outcome of the game in a very cool way, because I wouldn't have expected that. But still being able to steal, well, steal is a harsh word, we're able to copy the Agent of Treachery and then steal. every creature at the table except for Bilal's and Galia was also very cool. So it was a lot of fun being able to do some kind of crazy shenanigans with Mogg Bombers, even though Mogg Bombers wasn't in play on our side of the board, which I thought was a ton of fun. So I hope you all enjoyed the game. I know I certainly did. If you did enjoy it, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. Like I said, we're making that push, trying to get to 1,000 by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it if you could help us get there. If you liked it, share it with your friends, all that fun stuff. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments what you liked, what you didn't, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.